Over the last 40 years, China has been transformed out of all recognition. The scale of its growth and the sheer speed of change is astonishing. Nothing like this has ever happened before. But as China rises, others will fall. In the 21st century, the balance of power in the world is changing. So how did an impoverished and backward communist country become an engine of global capitalism?
Just 40 years ago, China had a new leader, a 5-foot-tall, chain-smoking veteran of the Long March with a reputation for pragmatism over ideology, Deng Xiaoping. Under Deng, China renounced class struggle and embraced the market. It saw the biggest lifting of people out of poverty that has ever taken place in human history. China became a global economic force, predicted to become the world's biggest economy in a couple of decades. But what actually happened 40 years ago? And how did China do it?
China has 1.4 billion people, a fifth of all humanity. And for the last 2 centuries, they've been engaged in a long-running struggle over the different pathways to modernity.
China was a leading nation over 1,000 years to the early 17th century. Then China began to close door. We don't need these Western gadgets. We are so powerful. We have everything on the earth. So from then on, China began to decline. China closed off and complacent.
The Chinese call what followed the century of humiliation, and its memory has marked China to this day. It suffered colonial oppression, Japanese invasion, and then civil war. 14 million Chinese people died in World War II alone. And in the countryside, the people were reduced to starvation.
From 1840, the first Opium War with UK, the longest continued stability for China was no more than 10 years. So China's modernization process was interrupted again and again. And by foreign aggression, by peasant uprising, by civil wars.
So the communist triumph of 1949, they hoped, would bring peace. But soon economic disasters led to the Great Famine. And then in the 60s, the class struggles of the Cultural Revolution, when Chairman Mao waged war on China's traditional culture.
China had struggled with modernization because previously China had tried to modernize in keeping China's old traditional way of doing things. And the Cultural Revolution essentially was an attack on China's traditional way of doing things.
By the early 70s, the country was traumatized and exhausted, its economy in ruins. The people were desperate for a new path.
Most people, I'd say, ordinary people, were fed up with this excessive, radical, ideological campaigns one after another. So Deng Xiaoping personified this kind of demand for change.
Deng had been a party stalwart from the time of the Long March and the Civil War. But in the Cultural Revolution, he was purged for criticizing Mao. Exiled to the countryside, he worked as a fitter in a tractor factory.
Deng had been in the top leadership ever since 1949. And then he spent about 3 years in the countryside. A lot of the greatest leaders, Churchill, de Gaulle, Abraham Lincoln, they all had been in very high positions, fell, and then had time to think.
And Deng's conclusion was that rigid ideology had wrecked China's economy. In the 1970s, China was an agricultural country. 80% of the people worked the land. And after 3 decades of communism, they were still poor.
老百姓的生活很苦大。我从出生到20岁，不管是冬天夏天，都没有穿过鞋。那个老百姓啊，有辆自行车啊，就感到很富有的啦。
When I was growing up, hunger always haunted me. Almost every day, the thought of finding something to eat was always there.
The overriding priority was to lift the people out of poverty. And in 1976, when Mao died, the opportunity came. Deng Xiaoping returned from exile, determined to change China's direction.
Deng had a vision, and it was that China should become more prosperous. He shared Mao Zedong's concept that the only way for China to become more prosperous was to have stability, and he believed, as did Mao, that the only way you could have stability was through one-party rule by a communist party that kept all of the power in its own hands. But Mao's concept was not really stability. It was permanent revolution. And Deng didn't accept that. So when Deng came back after Mao died, his vision was that to get rich is glorious and that you do it in the most efficient way.
But to achieve that, Deng first needed to outflank the hardline conservatives in the party leadership. And when he came back, he asked first to be put in charge of education.
而现代化就需要人才，这个时候国家最缺的就是人才。所以邓小平恢复工作之后，他首先提出要分管教育和科技工作。
The first step was to undo the damage caused by Mao's war on the middle class.
1966, when the Cultural Revolution broke out, they closed down universities. They closed down all the examinations. There were a few people who received party recommendations to go to school, but schools were not operating the way they should.
When I finished my high school, I went to a factory in Shanghai. I did not have any hope to enter university.
A whole generation of China's youth had been sent to the countryside for what was called re-education, through hard manual labor to learn what it was like to be a peasant.
I was the probably last cohort of people from high school that have to go to the countryside to receive re-education. I was thinking of my life was just, I'm stay there for my lifetime. Just going to be in that village.
And then in summer 1977, Deng called a conference in Beijing on the future of education.
Higher Education Department, Professor Liu Daoyu, he told me, you are invited by the Deng Xiaoping tomorrow in the Great Hall, in Beijing. I go to the People Great Wall. But no people speak. Because at that time, that after Cultural Revolution, they are very fear,
People were scared to
yeah,
speak out.
Scared,
yeah.
Then the Deng Xiaoping say, you can take any opinion freely, comfortably.
And did you speak?
I propose to the Deng Xiaoping, I have an opinion.
I propose 16 words for the inter of the university.
Those 16 words would change modern China. Exams should start again as soon as possible. They should be free, fair, and open to all, not just the party. Deng agreed, and the first exams took place that December of 1977.
When the news announced that actually we can take the examination to get into college, we were just so happy and was exhilarated. It's just such a life-changing sort of moment for us.
It was very tough. 5.7 million candidates applying for the exam. Only less than 5% were admitted, and ages varied from 18 to 35. In my class, I was 20 at that time. They were coal miners, they were farmers, they were soldiers, they were workers, young apprentices like me. So that exam changed the life of many people.
In a culture that had for so long believed in the value of education, it was a transformational moment.
因为我的父母是教师，我这样的家庭，我深知教育的重要性，深知多学一些对自己是有用的，当然对国家也是有用的，所以很有学习的动力。
So your ambition was to be a teacher as well?
当时我曾经想做教授，我记得当我说出这个愿望的时候，还遭到了一些人的讽刺。后来果然做了教授。
For Deng, it was the first step in his path to power. The following year, 1978, he emerged as preeminent leader.
He wasn't fully in charge. Hua Guofeng was still officially the top leader, but it was clear that he had been given the authority by his colleagues to be the dominant figure. He realized that all those people who had spent their lives working for Mao, including himself, who started in 1922, that what they'd been thinking about was completely wrong. And to be able to lead that kind of dramatic change, to get several hundred million people to accept something quite new and quite different, was absolutely necessary.
When I graduated from college in 1978, I could feel the strong wind of change. The Chinese, many people like me, the Chinese started to face the world and rediscover the world and also to learn from the world.
In May 1978, Deng sent a 5-week fact-finding mission to Europe, led by Gu Mu.
古牧是中国国务院的副总理。1978年的5月初到6月初，他率领了一个30人的代表团，到西欧5个国家访问，包括法国、联邦德国、瑞士、比利时和丹麦。
They were shocked by what they saw. They'd been taught that capitalist countries brutally exploited their workers and were backward and decadent. But now they saw for themselves how far communist China had fallen behind.
他回国以后，向中央政治局提交了一份书面报告。第一，他认识到欧洲国家的经济、科技发展水平很高，而中国远远地落后了。古牧还汇报了一个重要的情况，就是这5个国家领导人都希望同中国建立密切的经济联系。
And they were prepared to help China also, is that right? Yeah.
因为他们意识到中国是巨大的市场，帮助中国发展的同时，他们自己也能得到发展的机会。
Deng himself now went on a mission to Singapore and Japan.
Deng was one of the few communist leaders in China who was exposed to the outside world. He spent almost 6 years in France as a part work, part study student. So this kind of international outlook helped him.
In Japan, Deng understood the extent of China's backwardness.
新干线列车当年是210公里的时速，而中国的列车时速是60公里，反差如此之大，可想而知邓小平受到了什么样的刺激。
He saw modern robots in the factory making cars. He saw the most modern steel plant in the world at that time. He talked to Matsushita, the great electronics man, and he could see the extraordinary technology. And he was excited like a little kid in seeing all those things.
Deng wanted the Chinese people to see for themselves how others lived.
He asked specifically the Central Television crew to film people's life. He said, please focus on how ordinary people in Japan lived, in Singapore lived. It's an eye-opening for Chinese at that time. You know, when the Chinese saw through the television, Japanese workers have refrigerators at home, you know. It's awakening, it's a shock.
In 1978, there were no fridges and TVs in the Chinese countryside. Hundreds of millions worked the land in a rigid system of collective farms, huge communes on the Stalinist model. But it had been a total failure. China was still starving. This is Fengyang in Anhui province. A fifth of the county had died in the Great Famine in the early 1960s. And here the seeds of change were beginning to sprout at the grassroots. That winter of 1978, in the village of Shaogang, desperate local farmers broke with the commune system of collective farming. In this house, on the 24th of November, they secretly swore a pact to go back to family farms, selling their surplus. It was against the law, and the penalties were severe. But in this room, risking their lives, they put their thumbprints to what they called a life or death contract.
40年前，在小岗村，没有一块砖，没一片瓦，家家住的都是破茅草房子，就是泥巴垒的墙，上面盖的草。这证明过去没有钱呐，穷啊。现在老百姓到处逃荒要饭。
我那时候4个孩子都出世了，最小的都出世了。那个粮食呢，肯定是不够吃，这个生活困难，所以我们才按那个所谓来解决温饱啊。
What were the words that you put on the document? What was the agreement you made together?
我们签那个协议啊，我们上面写的，这个我们分田到户，每户户主签字盖章。如果说能干，每户要完成顾家的，过去叫公粮，不想顾家，伸手要粮要钱。如果说干不成，干不杀头，小孩养活到18岁。我们的文书就这样写的。
And were you scared that the government might find out? Was it dangerous to do that?
所以说呢，我们当时的心情啊是特别的沉重。如果说不这样干，我们就被饿死；如果这样干，我们要担风险。最后我们就选择了这条路。我们宁愿去坐牢去杀头，我们还要帮土地分到各家各户。
So the ordinary people of China wanted change. The party leadership, though, was still split over the course China should take, between the reformers and the hardliners who feared opening up the market would betray the revolution. Sensing the mood in the nation that autumn, Deng Xiaoping convened a conference about labor in Beijing.
The big grey building on the corner is the Jinxi Hotel. It's quite difficult to find. There's no sign saying it's a hotel, and not everybody can book in there, especially if you're a foreigner. Although if you look it up on TripAdvisor, it says that the decor is lovely and the staff are extremely good looking and very well trained. But it's owned by the People's Liberation Army, and many important meetings of the Communist Party have taken place there over the last few decades, showing the path of China's future. But none of them so important as the meeting in December 1978.
"200 delegates from all over China met here in this room to discuss the economy and the commune system of agriculture. Still under Mao's shadow, they were divided about the future. So maneuvering against the hardliners, Deng prepared a short keynote speech that crystallized all he'd thought about in his years in the countryside. The key, Deng said, was to reject ideology. From now on, we must seek truth from facts. We have to think about what we've done. We're too poor, too backward. I honestly feel sorry for the people. From now on, he said, we must embrace science and technology and open up the market to change the backward condition of our country. The conservatives were shocked. The reformers were excited. Deng concluded, the time has come to liberate our minds. But that winter, Deng was also looking abroad. The USA recognized the nationalists in Taiwan, not the communists on the mainland, as the legitimate rulers of China. But now Beijing and the US were in secret negotiations. Stapleton Roy was there.
Our relations with China for 20 years were frozen in a pattern of total hostility. During those 20 years, the relations between China and the Soviet Union deteriorated, and we couldn't take advantage of that. And that's what the secret negotiations were all about. We had to break relations with a friendly government. We had to end a security treaty with a friendly government. And we had to remove all of our military forces from Taiwan. And so President Carter was given the choice. Did he want to only get a partial relationship with China, or was he prepared to take the enormous steps necessary in order to get a full diplomatic relationship with China? It was very awkward. Before we began the negotiations, we briefed the top leadership in Congress, both the Republican and Democratic leadership in Congress, as to what our bottom line was in the negotiations. And what they told us was, you're doing the right thing, but we are going to criticize you. Right. So in other words, they were supportive of what we were doing, but for political reasons, they were going to criticize the way it was done.
On the 1st of January 1979, the US recognized the People's Republic. And then in mid-January, Deng went to Washington to meet President Jimmy Carter.
Today we take another step in the historic normalization of relations which we have begun this year.
The eyes of Texas were on Deng Xiaoping today as the Chinese Vice Premier continued his tour of this country.
In an 8-day trip, Deng visited Seattle, Atlanta, and NASA in Houston. He even had time to get down home at a Texas rodeo. But behind the fun was a cool, calculating brain. He needed the US to help his reform.
因为他们意识到中国是巨大的市场，帮助中国发展的同时，他们自己也能得到发展的机会。
Engagement had a number of goals, some of which were self-serving on our part, some of which had to do with changing China, at which the West has been extraordinarily successful. There's no question about where the lion's share of influence has flowed. And much of the energy of engagement, and I'm not talking here about government to government, but the institutions, universities, in some cases, cities, counties, churches that were involved in engagement, it really was about development for a lot of them, about lifting people out of poverty and improving their lives as a matter of human sympathy.
To finance the first stage of the reform, Deng asked the UN for help. He'd already made a speech there in 1974 calling for a new economic order. And China, he dreamed, would one day lead it. The person sent to China to begin the UN's aid program was a young tech consultant, Jack Fensterstock.
In the summer of 1978, I was contacted by a ranking official at the UN asking me to come to New York to discuss with them a highly secretive project. And they told me that at the meeting, that by the end of the year, China was going to announce its opening up to the world, and that it was felt that they would need some technical assistance. So I was asked to lead this sort of programming mission to try to figure out what China wanted to do and how the UN could help.
In the area of computing, which by the late 70s was clear was going to be the future, the third industrial revolution, right, they were way behind.
They were way behind, and they realized this. And the money was used for the equipment, mainframes, and what they called at that time mini computers, the training of their people, better ways of storing and retrieving, the world's science and technological and industrial information. We put in a rudimentary hospital information system. China just had all these pieces of paper. There was no way of it being organized, so we set up a database system. And then getting into the area of how to, do database modeling, econometrics models, and, all of this, they took off very, very quickly.
So in early '79, the stage was set for the reforms. Guangzhou on the Pearl River in South China was to be the testing ground. China's historic commercial capital, the city had gone into a steep decline since the revolution of 1949.
When you came here 40 years ago, what you saw was a skyline of decaying factories with old-fashioned machinery, poor infrastructure, almost no cars in the streets. Guangzhou, said a local Communist Party official, has become the tired old man of the Pearl River Delta. And the reason was very simple. What good is production without consumers?
My first visit to China was 1973. And at that time, I remember in Guangzhou, there were still dog carts. There were a lot of people without clothes who were so thin that you could not, wondered if they were going to make it.
On his return from the States, Deng came down south to initiate the economic reforms. A short drive into the Pearl River Delta, you could look straight across to Hong Kong, then still under British rule. 40 years ago, this was a vision of the promised land. This strait was the gateway to a better life for thousands of poor Chinese whose dreams of wealth often ended in bitter disappointment and even tragedy.
700,000 people, mainly young men, had attempted to cross over to Hong Kong, but many of them swimming directly across. 140,000 made it. Most were turned back, but many drowned. One of the coves here became known as the Cove of Corpses. The reasons for the migration, of course, were economic. You could earn over there 100 times the daily wage of a laborer here in Guangzhou.
To change that, Deng Xiaoping found an ally in the new boss in Guangdong, an old revolutionary comrade who shared his views on reform. Xi Zhongxun, the father of today's President Xi Jinping.
这小组讨论的发言里面，习仲勋就说，广东那么困难，经济那么落后，主要还是上面捅得太死了，中央捅得太死了。 如果广东中央给点全广东放开一点，不要统得那么死，独立的国家啊，让我自己来弄，没有人干预我的，我几年就可以把它搞上去。邓小平就肯定习仲勋，就是要撒出一条血路来，叫他要撒出一条血路来。
So Xi Zhongxun was now free to broker huge deals for local industry, unleashing the potential of the new economic reforms. Here in Shenzhen, then just a rocky peninsula opposite Hong Kong, a local entrepreneur proposed a business plan involving foreign investment, a no-go since 1949.
He had a plan to create a breaker's yard here, where old Chinese merchant vessels, and there were lots of them, would be broken to pieces and sold as scrap metal to Hong Kong merchants the other side of the water to feed the construction boom over there. Now, of course, there was no space for such an enterprise, but there was here. So on the 31st of January 1979, barely a month since the plenum meeting in the Jinxi Hotel in Beijing, the deal was signed. The first foreign investment contract in the history of the People's Republic of China.
Deng had warned Xi that central government had no money to give him, but they devised a plan to try to free the economy through local enterprise. They called it a special economic zone.
This was totally typical of Deng Xiaoping's approach. They set up these 4 experimental zones near Hong Kong and Macau. And they permitted market forces to operate in those zones, but not elsewhere in the country. And when the zones were wildly successful, in large measure because Hong Kong took advantage of the cheap labor available on the mainland and moved their production facilities into these special zones. And this then became the model for the entire country.
In a system stifled by bureaucracy and ideology, Deng's idea was to give more freedom to local initiative.
I think this is really the key. Test something at the local level, see if it works. If it works, expand it on a regional level. If there's pushback, pull it back and retool it and expand it again.
Thousands of small businesses were now allowed to spring up everywhere across China. The first on the coast of Zhejiang at Wenzhou, which had always been less controlled by Beijing because of its location.
You can see how Wenzhou's been shaped by geography. Hemmed in by the mountains, cut off from the interior, it's always been an outward-looking place. From the Sung dynasty onwards, its merchants have sailed down the river, up the coast to the Yangtze Delta cities, down to the Pearl River and on to Vietnam. So when the great opening up happened 40 years ago, this city, with its clan-based businesses, was ideally situated to take advantage of the new opportunities. And Wenzhou was the first city in China to establish a system of small private enterprise.
Wenzhou would be the birthplace of China's private economy. 130,000 small businesses, from noodle bars to China's first private airline. And the first private business certificate in 1979 was issued to a young woman selling knitting in the street. She's still here.
那时候我们已经把小小摊在自己家门口摆了嘛，他们就过来告诉我们，就是说我们现在可以，国家有新的政策了，你们也许就是可以做生意了，领取一个营业执照，个体的营业执照，拿到执照以后，我真的很高兴哦，有了这张证，有了保证一样。 对我们个体来说呢，是一个保证。
So, how did you get into buttons then? How did the button story come?
客人呢来问，你家有没有衣服上的纽扣有没有？后来我就一想呢，去上海，那么就去上海呢，城隍庙那边那边看了一下纽扣特漂亮，我就拿个几十个过来。 拿到我们温州这个小摊子，大家都很喜欢啊。后来嘛，从那时候80年以后，从那时候呢，我就是拿几百个、拿几千个，做小批量生意了，是这样的。
So China embarked on an economic and social experiment, mixing the communist command economy with the energy of capitalist enterprise.
Deng Xiaoping took a position of absolute pragmatism. And the view was it doesn't matter if it's socialism or market as long as it works. And this idea of combining both at that time was something that international economists, Western economists, IMF, World Bank did not accept. But that's what they did.
The Communist Party could push through big construction projects quickly, providing the infrastructure for growth. But they also needed to liberate talents lower down the chain of command, as Deng Xiaoping put it, to democratize economic production.
The big thing that we realized is that they had to somehow release sort of pent-up productive forces. And since the biggest component of productive forces is the human capital element, they spent a lot of effort on this. So they changed from one-man rule into collective leadership. No longer could decisions just be made up at the top. So they gave people downstream the responsibility and the authority to make decisions.
So motivated and talented middle people were really important in this project.
The most important.
Yeah.
These were the real people who got everything done.
And to train the managers of the future, Chinese students were sent to foreign universities without party control. In the next 20 years, over 200,000 studied in the US alone.
I remember, I think it's Brzezinski, National Security Advisor to Jimmy Carter, asked them, how many students you want to send to the United States. Then said, how many you can receive. For us, no limit. So it's a lot of courage, because at that time, living standard between China and the West was so different. China was much lower, and many were concerned that students may not choose to return to China. And Deng said at internal party meetings that if 1 out of 10 can return to China, this policy will be a victory for us.
But success in the universities depended on standards in schools. And a major feature of the reform process was a huge investment in primary and secondary education, especially for women.
I remember when I was in the middle school, in my class, there were lots of students from the countryside, from nearby villages. And there were very few girls. And even the few in our class, they were constantly urged by their parents to quit study and go home. But all these have changed as the society has progressed. Now you see in the countryside, boys and girls are in the schools, and they can decide their own future.
By the early 80s, the signs of reform were everywhere, from the schools to the cars on the streets where once there were only bicycles. And a huge demographic change began.
A key feature of China's modernization process has been urbanization. The rural population of China has been moving into the cities at a rapid pace. Now, to understand China's rapid economic growth, the productivity of a rural worker who moves into a city and gets a factory job increases about 20 times.
With a fast-growing middle class, production had to keep pace with consumer demand. And though big centrally controlled factories dominated, tens of thousands of small enterprises accounted for a growing percentage of national output in construction materials and clothes and leather. This shoe factory in Wenzhou was a typical early 80s success story.
1980年，我们这家企业创办，应该来说，当时也是迎着改革开放、中国改革开放的冲锋。当时也是一家小作坊，慢慢的现在发展到了中国鞋业的领军企业啊。目前我们有全国各地有2万多名员工，而且品牌现在广受消费者的喜爱。中国鞋都，它有一个非常健全的产业链的一个发展的格局。
So in just 4 years, China's agriculture, education and industry were reformed, private business allowed to flourish. They even opened a stock exchange. The energies of the Chinese people were being liberated.
You're talking about social transformation, economic transformation, psychology changing. All of these things have moved at such a huge pace. It's often baffles people here, not to say foreign observers who are trying to catch up and understand what's happening.
But Deng Xiaoping's concept of political reform was still only within one-party rule.
He embraced only economic liberalization. He rejected political liberalization or globalization, the Western style. He said we must be very cautious on the political front. I call his political reform is rationalization, not democratization.
Chinese discourse of modernization since 1978 has been distinct from what we call modernity in the West. China has never claimed interest in liberal ideas and values. It has claimed that it is pursuing modernization, by which it means economic and technological well-being.
Economically, this meant seeking new relationships and trade deals around the world. But politically, the absolute power of the Communist Party was reaffirmed.
Deng was a pragmatist. His famous quote, you know, is it doesn't matter whether a cat is black or white. If it catches rats, it's a good cat. And he was experimental in looking for the best way to accomplish something. But the real changes to socialism in China occurred after Deng.
So after decades of struggle, China's path to modernization had been set. At the beginning, China's low production costs offered huge opportunities to the outside world.
What was happening was the valve was opening. I worked on a lot of the early inbound investments. I did the very first deal for ExxonMobil, for Roche Pharmaceutical, for Bayer Chemical. I negotiated Ericsson's first joint venture here.
And with its fast expanding urban workforce, China's GDP would increase nearly 70 times in 40 years.
The reform and openness policies have been wildly successful in modernizing Chinese society and its economy. But China has what I call a pre-modern political system. It's based on this concept that power should be concentrated in the hands of the rulers. And all modern political systems are based on the concept that power corrupts, and therefore it needs to be checked and balanced, and that the just powers of governance are derived from the consent of the governed. So there needs to be some sort of legitimization process. China does not accept those modern concepts. And so the contradiction between the way that China is being ruled and the nature of the society that has been transformed through the success of the reform and openness policies is a fundamental contradiction in China.
But 40 years on, that's not a contradiction to the Chinese government, who proclaim their marriage of one-party rule and capitalist enterprise as the Chinese way. And their economy is changing now. Big Chinese companies have seized their chance in a global environment.
So 1999, the time when Alibaba was founded, the name, that's always linked to the story, Open Sesame. So Open Sesame, that means like how we can help the small and middle-sized enterprises to do the business. Open the treasure.
Across the whole world.
Exactly, okay. Maybe like people have not realized, Alibaba from day one is a kind of globalization, the symbol. Because the first website of Alibaba is in English.
So as companies like Alibaba reach out to the world, economic liberation has enabled the growth of a huge Chinese middle class with its own tastes and desires.
China's middle class, it's about 400 million. It's bigger than the population of the United States, getting bigger. And these are people who are early adapters of technology, who value education extremely highly and will suffer for it individually and as a family. They are also people who believe in increasing their national prestige. The rate of accumulation of wealth, of course, is slowing, but it's still fairly high. And not only are they early adapters of technologies, but they are adapting technologies and developing new products, new markets in a still relatively unregulated market where they don't face the kinds of consumer product protections that a lot of countries in the West and many in the East have. So they're moving forward very quickly.
And that lack of regulation has helped China catch up very fast with Western technology. Often playing fast and loose with intellectual property.
I don't buy into this that everything has been copied. What they did was called learning by doing. And what they did was they imported know-how and technology. They weren't so interested in the how of it, the theory of it. Let's put it to work. Let's start putting people to work. Let's start adding to the economy. And we have time, later on to figure all this out. But they started their own programs. They don't want to be dependent anymore on outside people for technology.
A key example is China's high-speed train workshops.
10年的时间，我们就从技术引进，然后到自主研发，然后到完全自主开发设计的这个高铁动车组。
How big is the network now? Is the network expanding every year?
到2017年底，然后中国的这个高铁里程是2.5万公里，然后基本上这个里程加起来是占全世界从第2名到第10名国家总和，然后这个是属于世界第一。
That's incredible. 25,000 kilometers of high-speed network. Looking at the future. The network is still expanding. How do you see the future?
到2025年，应该全国的高铁线是3.8万公里。我们时刻准备着走到国外去。
And now, the Chinese government is pursuing globalization through their Belt and Road Initiative, linking up the trade of Asia, Europe, and beyond by land and sea. Searching for new markets and raw materials, it's an infrastructure project of extraordinary scale and ambition.
Right back in the Middle Ages, Chinese junks and Arab dhows carried the produce of China, tea and silk, and especially ceramics, to the Persian Gulf and the West. And now they're doing it again. From these container ports, ships are flooding across the world. And wherever you live, whether you're in the States or Africa or Asia, there'll be something here that ends up on your table.
And with growing economic power comes increasing political and cultural influence. The balance of power in the world is shifting very quickly.
China is very adept at spreading its practices or getting acceptance for its practices through money, through the markets. And this is not a nefarious plot. This is happening in the broad light of day and largely with the complicity of American corporations that want to sell into China. But it has an impact here. And I think that the most telling example is Hollywood. Hollywood's profit model is the blockbuster. China has the world's highest box office. If you want to be a blockbuster, you therefore must play in China. China censors films heavily. The result is that American filmmakers, Hollywood, and these are the people who would claim to be the architects of soft power and the celebrants of the human spirit, human freedom, they won't greenlight a script that can't show in China. So we have handed to them a direct channel for influencing what we see here at the multiplex. Money talks. China will become the tastemakers to the world, both at the supply and the demand side, because they have the numbers.
But China's influence will go beyond economics and culture. Its sheer size means that it will join the US as a leader in AI too. And AI will be the next phase of their superpower rivalry.
The AI is the fourth industrial revolution. The initial steam engine industrial revolution, electricity, the digital revolution of the 90s, and now AI. The oil that makes the AI machine run is data, and China will have more data because of its people and because it is able to direct and use their data as they wish. So China may be very well positioned to be one of the two leaders in artificial intelligence.
To pursue that goal, China is now encouraging big business to work with new tech universities. Many run by foreign-educated scientists who've come home.
This area is one of the most economically developed areas in China nowadays. And by combining Hong Kong and Macau, the central government has a plan to develop the whole Pearl Delta area into one of the biggest bay areas in the world to become competitive as compared to Tokyo Bay and San Francisco Bay.
And already, Chinese corporations like Tencent, Alibaba, and Huawei are spreading their influence around the globe, challenging the supremacy of US corporations. But they're also positioning themselves to take the lead in the greatest problem facing the world today: climate change. Having inflicted huge damage on their own environment, China signed up to the Paris Climate Agreement, and they're now massively investing in green technology, which they see as another growth opportunity, economically and politically, especially as the US has walked away from the Paris Accords.
China will lead on environment. It will be the global leader in the fight against climate change. It's also going to be one of the global leaders, if not the leader, on technology. It's already the largest investor in AI. AI is not just about robots serving you coffee. It's about all the technology required for environment. This involves massive data to manage water, hydro, solar, all of these systems, because this will create all kinds of jobs. This is not the environment preventing growth. The next growth opportunity is in fixing the environment.
That long-term vision, on the face of it, looks unstoppable. But commentators in the West think that China's unwillingness to embrace Western-style democracy might impede the country's progress in the future.
China's not necessarily committed to the idea that an electoral democracy can provide stability in China. But people like it when the party no longer tells them where they can go, where they can work, where they can study, what they can read, where they can travel. All of those freedoms emerged in China over the last 40 years. But the danger is, if you're open to the outside world, it's hard to maintain ideological conformity on the part of your population. China wants to become a world leader in artificial intelligence, in robotics, in a whole bunch of areas that require educated workforce, require highly educated people. And if China closes itself off from the outside world in order to maintain ideological conformity, they cannot sustain the same pattern of rapid growth.
How things will work out in the future, no one can tell. Western commentators have repeatedly predicted that China's mix of capitalism and one-party rule was bound to fail. So far, they've been proved wrong.
When China started its reform 4 decades ago, China's per capita GDP was lower than Tanzania, Kenya, with the level of Malawi. Now China is the second largest economy by official exchange rate and largest economy by PPP, purchasing power parity. And obviously China has done something right.
This old idea that a consumerist middle class would become an advocate for democracy tends to presume that these people are locked in place. But if you look at the way that people live in Beijing, in Shanghai, in Shenzhen, they go down to Thailand a few times a year. They go to the Paris, the French Open. They go to Turks and Caicos. They can import dairy from New Zealand. They can go to special hospitals for the rich. Their children are at school in the UK, in Canada, in the US. The system, the party has brought them to this. It has brought them this abundance, these opportunities. So I think that the day of reckoning, and that's a Western way of speaking, not a Chinese way of speaking, is probably a lot further off than we think.